From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Ciara Speller. As prices for fuel, food, energy, and other goods and services continue to rise, consumer confidence is falling. Inflation and a possible recession on the horizon has many people across the country wondering when the economy will get back on track or if they should be preparing for a fall. Today on 22 News in Focus, we're taking an in-depth look into the nation's economic situation. Joining me now is Carl Petrick, an associate professor of economics at Western New England University. Thanks for being here on the program today.
My pleasure.
The top issue on most people's minds is the price of oil and how it impacts gasoline and other fuels. Gas prices are at record high right now. So how are oil prices set?
Essentially, it's a global auction with thousands of transactions happening at the same time at various spots along the supply chain. Like any auction, if you have the highest bid, you win. In this case, you would own 1,000 barrels of oil.
And Carl, I want to ask you, what factors contribute to their fluctuation?
Global supply and demand are the biggest ones. So for example, back in April 2020, there was a point in time when the price of a barrel of oil was $17 per barrel. And that was because demand wasn't there because of the COVID shutdown globally. And on the 5th of this month, it was $120 a barrel. And that's because supply is not changed all that much, but demand is back.
Yeah, and why is the price of gasoline continuing to rise?
Big part of it's because of the price of oil. That's the first trigger. Price of oil goes up, and a couple weeks later, price of gasoline increases. And things that have affected global demand first, and demand domestically, of course, is we're traveling again. A lot of people went back to work. We're not working remotely as much. Airlines are back. People are traveling again. Over the holiday weekend, for example, is predicted to be just about back on par with 2019 in terms of how many people are traveling. And as a result, our demand's gone up, but plenty of problems along the supply chain to keep up with that demand.
Yeah, and so recently we've seen some of those pump prices go down a little bit, not much, but a little bit. So what would cause the prices of oil and gas to decline?
Another big factor of the price of oil is market expectations. It's ironic that the future price has a big effect on the spot price, which is the current price of oil. So the market started to think about the possibility of a recession or at least a big decline in economic growth, if not a recession. And they started to price that into, well, that's going to cause demand to go down. The price of oil fell, and that gave us a little bit of break at the pump in terms of the price of gasoline.
And I want to ask you this.
Sure.
President Biden has called on U.S. oil companies and other large producers of oil to increase their output and increase refining. So how much oil does the U.S. pump and refine annually?
We're the biggest oil producer in the world. And last year we produced, I'm trying to find it now. I just shot past it, of course. We produced 4 billion barrels of crude oil last year. And there's two measures. You have crude oil, which is just what it sounds like, and petroleum, which includes gasoline and diesel fuel and things like that. So we actually were the biggest producer last year. And we're also the 6th biggest exporter last year of petroleum, so not just of crude oil. In terms of refining, we use a different measure rather than just barrels. It's actually barrels per day. And the U.S. refined 15 million barrels per day of oil last year.
Yeah, and so with that being said, why do we need to buy from other countries?
Oil is not like just one thing. So there's different types of oil, and without getting into like tons of detail. We're very good at producing light crude oil, and it does actually come from the density, how thick it is. So we're very good at producing that. We import primarily heavy crude oil, which is harder to refine, and we're very good at refining, and it's used for more specialty products and things like that. So that's a big part of it, that we actually produce more light crude oil than we want, so we export the remainder, and we import heavy crude oil that we then refine for a value added. So we export some of that and keep some of that, and that's a higher priced product. The other reason is just to keep up with demand. So, for example, our refineries typically are on the Gulf Coast, around Texas, Louisiana. It's sometimes cheaper for oil companies to export that oil or gasoline when they refined it to Mexico. It was much closer. A lot of demand up here in New England. We're a long way away from the Gulf Coast. So sometimes it's cheaper for us to import oil from Canada or even from Europe. And so the price points make a reason, one of the other reasons why we would be importing oil even while we're exporting it.
Yeah, and so with the holiday weekend here, right, lots of people planning on traveling, going to different states. Kind of talk about what they're going to be seeing there compared to, Massachusetts.
Depends where you're traveling. The price of gasoline in Massachusetts has been pretty high, but if you look at, say, California, for example, we've done pretty well. If you're traveling around the southeastern United States and around the Gulf of Mexico, price of gasoline's been pretty low there. You're looking at maybe a 50-cent swing per gallon between us and, say, like Texas, Louisiana, roughly. So depends where you go. It also depends on, of course, their tax that the states have too on that, which has a big effect, and whether they've taken a tax holiday on the gas tax, which makes a difference right now between Connecticut and Massachusetts, for example.
Okay, thank you. Carl Petrick here with us. And what other factors are influencing our economy's recovery? We'll have that discussion when we return. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about the current state of the U.S. economy with Carl Petrick, an associate professor of economics at Western New England University. So Carl, the COVID-19 pandemic impacted all of us in different ways. For some Americans, the loss of a job brought severe financial struggle. So how well overall is our economy recovering from the pandemic?
Overall, we've done really well by a lot of measurements. Unemployment is right around the pre-pandemic low. That's true in Massachusetts as well as nationally. Labor force participation, which is a measure of how many people that could be working are in the labor force, is also right around that level too. So the jobs came back. One of the big differences, of course, is inflation overall, which is much higher than it was pre-pandemic.
And how helpful was the CARES Act relief for families and businesses for the economy?
It was very helpful. It provided a level of resilience that wouldn't have been there otherwise, which means that people were able to weather the downturn and the shutdown much better than they would have. And there was plenty of criticism about it. It was, a very blunt instrument. Everybody got the checks, not just done by income, for example. And while that's true, there's plenty of evidence that it helped poor households the most, which is what it was designed to do.
And I want to ask you this now. Which industries are seeing the most rapid growth and which are still struggling?
Ironically, the answer is sometimes the same industry. Tourism and hospitality have grown very fast. They're also still way below their pre-pandemic point. So movie theaters, for example, people are going back to the movies, but it's still very quiet compared to what it was. So you're seeing fast growth as well as they still haven't caught up yet. The tech industry had done well during the pandemic because everybody needed a new computer and a new laptop, new tablet, etc. They've struggled more in the new year, partly because of that fast growth tapering off. Once you have a laptop, you don't need another one for a while. As well as they're affected more by the higher interest rates. And retail has had a very mixed bag, kind of what we call the red brick retail. The stores have still seen customers kind of not coming back, while online retail has done very well and continues to do well.
And let's talk about the gross domestic product, or GDP. Is that a good indicator of economic recovery?
As an overall measure, it's pretty good. GDP measures the amount of output of goods and services in an economy, and that's really good indicator overall. Where it struggles and it's not good as an overall measure of economic well-being, doesn't talk about the distribution of income, and it doesn't talk about health and things like that. So there are other measures which are important when you want to talk about the overall state of your population, but in terms of the economy, it's a pretty good catch-all.
Yeah, now to something that everybody's, still trying to digest and come to terms with, right? The Fed has raised interest rates. So explain why that's important and how it may impact our economic recovery.
One of the kind of basic ways to try to counter high inflation is through monetary policy, which is the Federal Reserve, raising interest rates. The idea is that you raise interest rates and you lower demand. Particularly investment demand, because as interest rates go up, it costs more money to borrow, and companies should slow down on their demand. It also affects household demand, particularly for what we call durable goods like cars and refrigerators and things like that. So that should kind of cool down the economy and get demand to be more in line with supply. That works really well when inflation is being caused by high demand, excess demand. This is not one of those cases. The prices are, by and large, being caused by, still the recovery from the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and things like that, which are, raising interest rates in the States doesn't solve those problems.
Yeah, and the pandemic brought on what's being called the Great Resignation, where people left jobs for new industries or more money and perks as employers competed to find workers. Also, pandemic unemployment payments stopped, but some people still are not working. So what does the national employment situation look like right now?
Yeah, you're very right that even though the unemployment rate is low, there are a lot of job openings, and it's a really kind of strange situation when you've got both of those things going on. Some parts of it are I don't want to lump everybody in the same boat, but some industries that were used to just having easy fill of jobs, like restaurants, for example, maybe haven't adjusted to having a much more picky workforce. People that worked in restaurants were badly affected by the pandemic shutdown, and they had to find new jobs, and they found jobs that paid better or had better conditions, whatever. That's one problem. The other problem too, ironically, is when people moved, a lot of people left the cities, for example, moved to the Berkshires, left New York City. They're now where the jobs aren't. The jobs are opening up in the big cities, and a lot of people have moved out, and that's part of the problem. And third problem is some people really liked working remotely, and for various reasons, whether they don't feel safe or they just like the conditions of working from home, are reluctant to go back into jobs which require them to even part-time be in the company. All those things are causing certain industries to have a hard time filling jobs.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly ask you, so with that hiring crisis, has the bankruptcy rate among businesses and individuals increased in the past couple of years?
It actually fell in 2020 and 2021, and certainly the recovery programs helped a lot in that regards. Personal bankruptcies and business bankruptcies went up month on month in 2021, but are still below the rate from 2022, but are still below the rate of 2021. So far, we haven't seen a big uptick of bankruptcies in the recovery. We saw a bunch early on as small companies couldn't stay shut forever and things like that, but since then it's been pretty quiet.
All right, Carl, we thank you for your insight. So how are global markets influencing our economic recovery? That discussion after a short break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus, and today we've been discussing the state of the U.S. economy with Carl Petrick, an associate professor of economics at Western New England University. All right, the U.S. dollar is the most widely used currency in the world. We trade with every country across the globe, and the COVID-19 pandemic affected business worldwide. So, Carl, are the U.S. and global business cycles synchronizing during this economic recovery?
To a large extent, yes, because they're global effects. We're all affected by the COVID pandemic and the shutdown. We're positively affected by reopening, and also the war in Ukraine also has affected things globally. So to a large extent, the U.S. and global economies are kind of synced up over the last several years.
And how are other countries recovering compared to the U.S.?
You know, the U.S. did pretty well. Last year, the U.S. economy grew by 5.7% overall, and the average for advanced economies was 5%. So, you know, give us a C plus or B minus if you want to be generous. We're kind of middle of the pack there. Other countries grew a bit faster, but plenty grew slower as well.
So how do international stock markets impact our economy?
You know, there is an effect in a way that people don't necessarily think about. In your 401k plan, for example, I guarantee you there are international businesses and foreign businesses in that portfolio. And that's good diversification, by the way. That's something that should be done. However, then you are, open to, if, say the Australian economy goes into recession or European economy goes into recession, that's going to affect that part of your portfolio, but not other parts. So there is that impact. And because we are in a global economy, as you said, and companies do buy and sell from each other, and even within their various parts, if you're a company like Pfizer or IBM, for example, what happens in foreign markets does affect U.S. companies as well.
And how important is the global economy for the U.S.?
But by one measure, not that important, in that we have a big economy, and so trade accounts for maybe about 11% of our gross domestic product, which is low compared to some countries. However, as we've seen with the different issues we've had during the pandemic and the reopening, is we are very much part of a global supply chain, and U.S. companies depend on imported parts, and U.S. parts are exported to various parts of the world. And so in that regards, we're very much dependent on the global trade as a way of just continuing to make things.
Yeah, and a big problem we were seeing for a while, still seeing it sometimes. During the pandemic, products sat on docks in major ports around the world, including right here. So is that backlog being cleared up?
Yes and no. Initially, it was some weird things were happening because of the COVID shutdown, where literally shipping containers were in the wrong ports compared to where the goods were. It's just how fast things shut down. And then once trade reopened, these ships were kind of getting to the ports, like say Los Angeles is one of the busiest. They were getting to the ports at the same time, and there just wasn't enough space to unload the ships. That's still an issue, but most of the backup now in U.S. ports aren't so much the ships, it's on the docks themselves and the rail yards where containers are not being moved fast enough to get to stores.
And how did the trade deficit increase during the pandemic, and who benefited?
The trade deficit actually fell a bit initially during the pandemic, again, because so many things were shut down. It increased over the last couple of years, in part because we were growing faster than a lot of our trading partners. So while we were demanding more imports, demand for U.S. exports was still kind of low because their economies weren't recovering as fast, as well as during the pandemic and the early recovery. We're a service-based economy. We spend most of our money on services. We're buying goods, like all those computers and tablets that I was talking about. So as a result, those are imported, and that was another reason why we're seeing a big increase in the trade deficit.
Yeah, and so right now we're all watching the crisis unfold in Ukraine. I want to ask you, how does the war there impact international trade?
Quite a bit. One aspect is oil. Russia is, I think, the second biggest oil exporter, or they were before the embargo started to hit. Now, we don't get much oil from them. That's a minor aspect of our trade. But Europe gets a lot, of course, and it does affect the global price of oil, which affects price of oil and therefore price of gas in the United States. Another big impact actually is spilled over into the food prices and things like that, where the Ukraine is a big exporter of sunflower oil. Ukraine and Russia are big exporters of wheat and barley and things like that. And so as a result, the price for those are going up, and the price of other goods, just one example for sunflower oil, classic economics, you substitute. If sunflower oil is going up, I'm going to buy canola oil because it's cheaper. Not this year. Canada is the big producer of canola oil. They had a very bad crop season. And so as a result, the prices are being driven up by substitute goods as well.
Yeah, and I want to move just quickly, have you answer this. What short and long-term projections do economists have for the economy here and abroad?
Overall here, the consensus right now is that we're going to miss having a recession this year. The odds go up a bit for 2023, but the idea is so far is that it'll be a pretty shallow recession, so not anything like we saw under COVID or the Great Recession. So you're looking at the consensus of maybe 1% to 2% growth in the U.S., which is 2% would be very good actually. And then maybe I think 1 to 0.6% maybe in 2023. So a slowdown for sure. We'll feel that, but not a decrease in the size of our economy. So not a recession. Globally, similar. The forecasts have gone down. I think it's about for both this year and 2023. The consensus globally is about 2 to 3% growth. Overall, which again is a big slowdown from what it was coming out of the pandemic, but also not a worldwide recession, which is a good thing.
All right, Carl Petrick, thank you for your insight, and I'll have some final words after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You've been watching 22 News in Focus, and we've been talking about the U.S. economic recovery with Carl Petrick, an associate professor of economics at Western New England University. Carl, we want to thank you for being here on the program and providing this important information for our viewers.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all of you at home for watching. If you missed any of it, you can watch it in full on our website at wwlp.com. From all of us here at 22 News, have a good day.